The diary lies open on a scorched table. Its pages are curled at the edges, blackened with smoke, the ink bleeding where water once tried to save it. A hand trembling turns a page, and then the faint smell of burnt paper fills the air. The handwriting is neat, almost gentle, as if its author still believed the world could be civilized. 17th of February 1943. They took Yannick at dawn. He would not kneel. Outside, the winter wind moans through the ruins of Monte Cassino slopes. The guns have gone silent, but the ghosts remain. Polish ghosts who crossed deserts and oceans only to fight for a country erased from the map. And now, years later, these same men, soldiers of the 2nd Polish Corps, are prisoners again. Their diaries seized by men who fear what's written inside. In those pages are names, coordinates, and truths that Europe itself tried to bury, truths that would one day thunder through the courtroom at Nuremberg like artillery. If you are reading this, the final line says, then the fire did not win. The camera lingers on the ashes, then fades into the roar of 1944. The story begins long before the diary ever caught fire, before Monte Cassino, before the judges and the headlines. It begins in 1939, when a country was erased by 2 signatures. At dawn on September 17th, the eastern border of Poland dissolved under the rumble of Soviet tanks. Those who had survived the German invasion from the west now faced the Red Army from the east. Within days, entire regiments were surrounded. Officers were ordered to surrender. Those who refused vanished into the birch forests of Crécy, their names later appearing only in pencil lists smuggled through prisons. It was the birth of the 2nd Polish Corps, though they did not yet know it. Among the captured was Lieutenant Kazimierz Kucharski, a schoolteacher from Lwów turned artillery officer. His diary would begin here, scrawled on scraps of Soviet ledger paper torn from a factory wall. They loaded us into cattle cars, he wrote. No names, only numbers. We travel east, no one says where. For weeks the trains crossed the endless snowfields toward Siberia. When the doors finally opened, the air burned their lungs. They were marched into labor camps, Komi, Vorkuta, Arkhangelsk, places where the sky never fully brightened. Men built rail lines that went nowhere, chopping frozen timber with bare hands. Each night they whispered prayers in Polish, hoping someone somewhere still remembered them. In the spring of 1941, fate shifted. Hitler turned on Stalin. Overnight, the prisoners of one enemy became the potential allies of another. A treaty was signed, the Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement, promising the release of Polish captives from Soviet camps to form a new army under British command. The gates opened slowly, grudgingly, but for thousands it was enough. They stumbled south, starving and sick, through Uzbekistan toward Persia. Those who survived the march called themselves the Living Ashes. It was here, amid the Persian dust, that General Władysław Anders formed the 2nd Polish Corps, an army built from exiles, orphans, and ghosts. British officers watched in disbelief as men in rags saluted with discipline born of faith alone. They had no homeland, no future, only the certainty that somewhere in Europe their families were dying behind barbed wire. Their flag, white and red with the crowned eagle, was banned, yet they carried it anyway. Kucharski's diary resumed. We are reborn in the desert. Our skin burns. Our hearts freeze. Anders says we will fight for the world that forgot us. Training was brutal. Men who had once been professors or farmers now learned to drive tanks and field guns under the scorching Iranian sun. British supply officers laughed at their patchwork uniforms, at their insistence on morning prayers, at their refusal to swear allegiance to any land but Poland. Yet soon those same officers would salute them. By 1943, the 2nd Polish Corps was shipped to Palestine, then Egypt, the staging ground for the Italian campaign. Along the journey, the soldiers carried their notebooks, bound volumes, ration books, even cigarette paper diaries hidden in coat linings. They wrote everything: hunger, hope, the taste of oranges after years of snow. They believed writing kept them human. When they landed at Taranto in late 1943, the air reeked of oil and smoke. Italy was a graveyard of nations: Canadians, Indians, Gurkhas, New Zealanders, all climbing the boot toward Rome. For the Poles, every step was redemption. They were marching toward visibility, toward proof that Poland still fought. Their baptism came at Monte Cassino, that monstrous mountain crowned by a medieval monastery the Germans had turned into a fortress. The Allies had tried and failed 3 times to take it. When the order came for the Poles to assault, even hardened officers hesitated. "We will take it," Anders said quietly. "For Poland, and for those who cannot." The assault began before dawn on May 12, 1944. Rain fell in sheets, turning the slopes into rivers of mud and blood. Machine guns from the monastery tore the air apart. Men advanced in bursts, clinging to the rocks, praying between breaths. Kucharski wrote in pencil under a torn poncho, "We climb as if toward heaven, but it spits fire at us." For 4 days they fought without pause. When the white and red flag finally rose over the ruins of the abbey, the bells of Cassino rang for the first time in months. The mountain was theirs, and with it, the honor of a nation thought dead. Yet victory carried a cost too heavy to count. Whole companies lay silent under the rubble. Chaplains buried them with rosaries twisted around frozen fingers. The diaries of those days filled crates, names, sketches, hymns scribbled in margins. The Second Corps moved north toward Bologna, carrying the weight of both triumph and exile. In the villages they liberated, Italians greeted them as saviors, offering bread and wine. Children followed their columns, shouting, "Polacki, Polacki." For the first time, the soldiers smiled without guilt. But peace brought betrayal. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Poles expected to go home. Instead, they learned their homeland had been liberated by the same Soviets who had once imprisoned them. A new government in Warsaw, loyal to Moscow, declared Anders and his men enemies of the people. Return meant arrest and or worse. The British government, wary of angering Stalin, ordered the Second Corps relocated to transit camps in Italy and Britain. There thousands of Polish veterans waited in limbo, unwanted heroes stranded between victory and extinction. Many continued to write, filling their diaries with questions the world refused to answer. Kucharski's final entry from 1946 reads, "We have no country, only memories. If these pages burn, may the smoke carry our names home." The fire would come sooner than he knew. In 1947, under pressure from the new Polish communist authorities, British officers ordered the confiscation of sensitive materials, including diaries, letters, and sketches that documented Soviet atrocities in 1940-41. Officials claimed it was for archival review, but in secret, some of the diaries were slated for destruction to avoid diplomatic scandal. Crates were stacked in storage sheds near Naples. One night, flames rose from the docks. The guards said it was an accident. Survivors knew better. Yet some diaries escaped, hidden under floorboards, smuggled in toolboxes, wrapped in bread crusts. Years later, those charred pages would resurface, shocking the judges at war crimes tribunals when they revealed the first eyewitness Polish accounts of Katyn, of starvation camps, of Soviet interrogations long denied. The words that Stalin's censors tried to erase would testify instead. And so the story turns, from soldiers to prisoners, from writers to evidence. The next chapter will follow the burning and the men who risked their lives to save what little truth could fit between 2 covers of a diary. The docks of Naples never truly slept. Even after midnight, the air hummed with the murmur of engines, the slap of waves against hulls, and the rasping laughter of sailors who had forgotten how to be quiet. In the spring of 1947, the port was a city of ghosts, ships painted in victory gray, warehouses crammed with the unwanted debris of war, uniforms, trucks, rifles, and men. Among those men were thousands of Poles who had fought at Monte Cassino, Ancona, and Bologna. Soldiers without a flag, sleeping in tents beneath another nation's sky. They called the camp Campo Vittoria, but there was no victory left in it. Rows of barracks stretched along the waterfront, each one stenciled with fading British markings. At night, the men drank cheap wine and stared at the black outline of Vesuvius. In the distance, the volcano glowed faintly, a coal smoldering under its own ash. In one of those barracks sat Lieutenant Kazimierz Kucharski, his diary hidden beneath the boards of his cot. He had written every day since Siberia, through deserts, battles, and now exile. The notebook was thin, bound with thread, its pages mottled with sweat and salt. It contained everything the New World wanted to forget. The names of comrades executed by the NKVD, sketches of corpses found in the Katyn forest, and testimony of the amnestied prisoners who never came back. He knew that if anyone read it in Warsaw, it would mean a death sentence. but if no one read it at all, it would mean nothing. That spring, British liaison officers began visiting the camp. They carried briefcases stamped Foreign Office and spoke with the caution of men walking across ice. One morning, Captain Gerald Lister, a polite man with tired eyes, gathered the Polish officers in the mess hall. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing against the tin walls, "we've received instructions from London. All personal records relating to Soviet military conduct must be reviewed and collected. Diaries, letters, drawings, anything that might compromise post-war relations." A murmur rippled through the room. Someone muttered, "Compromise whom? The murderers?" Lister flinched slightly. "I don't write the orders," he said quietly. "You'll be compensated. Your materials will be archived properly in London." They all knew what that meant. The Poles had learned long ago that when government spoke of proper archiving, fire usually followed. That night, as rain hammered the roofs, soldiers whispered across bunks, arguing whether to surrender their diaries or hide them. Some burned their own pages rather than let strangers do it. Others buried notebooks in the rocky soil near the beach. Kucharski hesitated. He had seen too much, lost too many to silence. He could not let the truth vanish into smoke. He found allies among his comrades, men who understood that the written word was their last homeland. Sergeant Jan Baran, once a printer in Krakow, offered to smuggle a few volumes into town. "There are journalists," he said in a low voice. "Sympathetic ones. If they can get them to Rome, maybe the truth survives." Over the next week, bundles of diaries disappeared from the camp under blankets and bread crates. But the majority, hundreds of notebooks, sketches, and letters, were collected by British clerks and sealed in wooden crates marked POW documentation. On the evening of May 9th, the crates were loaded onto trucks bound for the port warehouses, awaiting transport to Malta. The following night, the fire began. No one knew exactly how it started. Some said a spark from a dock worker's cigarette caught on spilled fuel. Others whispered of deliberate hands. What was certain is that by midnight, Warehouse 17 was a furnace. Flames roared through the wooden walls, consuming paper and canvas faster than men could shout. The air filled with the stench of burning ink and varnish. Pages lifted into the night like glowing birds, then disintegrated into black snow. From the camp, the Poles saw the orange light rising over the bay. They ran toward it instinctively, soldiers again charging into fire. Kucharski reached the gates just as British guards blocked the road. "Restricted area," one shouted. "Stay back." "It's our history," someone cried. "Our brothers are in those pages." But rifles held them back. For hours they stood helpless, watching the blaze consume their memories. The reflection of fire danced on the dark water, and the wind carried the faint crackle of burning paper. When dawn came, the warehouses were ash and twisted metal. The air was thick with smoke that smelled of ink and loss. Captain Lister arrived just after sunrise, his uniform smeared with soot. He spoke little, his face pale. "Accident," he said mechanically. "Electrical fault. Nothing intentional." But even he couldn't meet their eyes. The Poles said nothing. Words had become dangerous things. Later, when the ashes cooled, a few men slipped past the guards and began digging through the debris. They found fragments, half-burned pages, bits of bindings, melted pens. Among them was a single sheet from Kucharski's diary, scorched but legible. It read, "If truth must die, then let it die screaming." They hid what little they recovered in their coats and slipped back into the camp. That night they made a pact. The diaries would be recopied from memory line by line as long as any of them lived to write. For weeks, the barracks became a silent scriptorium. Men hunched over candlelight, whispering dates and names, rewriting lost entries on stolen stationery. They knew it was hopeless. Memory fades faster than ink, but they wrote anyway. Each word was defiance. Meanwhile, British investigators filed reports confirming the accidental nature of the blaze. No culprits, no witnesses, yet rumors spread fast. Italian dock workers claimed to have seen two men in civilian clothes leaving the warehouse minutes before the explosion. They spoke Russian, someone said. Another swore he recognized a Soviet consular vehicle near the docks that night. Nothing was proven, but the pattern was clear. The Soviets wanted those diaries gone. They contained proof of crimes still denied. Of the 1940 executions in the forest near Smolensk, where thousands of Polish officers vanished. The ashes of Naples became the graves of those who had already been buried twice. By late summer, the camp began to empty. Some soldiers emigrated to Canada or Australia under new settlement programs. Others joined Labor Corps in Britain, digging canals or repairing roads under false names. A few returned to Poland, drawn by longing or guilt, and disappeared into the prisons of the new regime. Kucharski stayed. He continued to write. Though the act itself had become a form of rebellion, he wrote not for history but for conscience. His diary from that year was smaller, bound in scavenged leather. In one entry dated August 3, 1947, he described the night of the fire in painful detail. It burned like a cathedral. Each spark was a word screaming into heaven. I could smell the desert again, the blood at Cassino. The fire sounded like laughter. He had begun to believe the fire itself was part of a larger war, a war over memory. Unknown to him, not all the diaries had perished. A handful of volumes smuggled out by Sergeant Baran and his friends made their way to Rome. There, a Polish priest, Father Zygmunt Trzebinski, hid them in the basement of a Red Cross mission. From there, microfilm copies were sent to London through diplomatic pouches, disguised as church correspondence. In 1948, those same copies would land on the desk of an investigator at the Nuremberg successor trials, the hearings against Nazi and Soviet war crimes. The documents, charred and incomplete, revealed something extraordinary. Polish eyewitness accounts written years before the official discovery of mass graves at Katyn. They described Soviet officers wearing NKVD insignia, trucks loaded with bound prisoners, gunshots echoing in the woods. The pages bore dates, coordinates, even sketches of the burial pits. When the Allied judges read them, they were silent for a long time. One of them, an American colonel named Milton L. Gruenther, reportedly whispered, "These men wrote the truth before the world allowed it." The Soviets immediately denounced the diaries as fabrications by fascist elements. They demanded their removal from evidence. But the words had already been read, and once truth touches air, it refuses to vanish. In Naples, the veterans heard nothing. Their lives faded into labor and anonymity. They were janitors, carpenters, bus drivers. But every year, on May 9th, they gathered at the ruins of the old warehouses. They stood in silence, hats in hand, as the sea wind carried the smell of salt and smoke. Somewhere in those ashes still lay the bones of their words, the fragments of a nation written, burned and reborn. Kucharski grew old quietly. His final diary, recovered decades later by his grandson, ended with a line that reads more like prayer than prose. They tried to burn our truth, but even fire has memory. It remembers the hands that fed it. That sentence, once presented at a war crimes archive in London, was labeled Exhibit K-12, author unknown, probable witness to Katyn, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to a man who had survived every kind of prison except forgetting. London, 1948. The war was over, but the peace was still limping. The city's skyline, jagged with ruins, looked like a broken crown under the gray rain. In the corridors of the War Crimes Investigation Branch, the air smelled of paper and ink, the new battlefield where memory fought for survival. Here, inside a narrow office on Curzon Street, a stack of battered envelopes arrived each week from Rome. Most contained dull bureaucracy, repatriation forms, ration cards, lists of missing soldiers. But one morning in March, a clerk sliced open a plain envelope and found something that made him pause. Inside were photographs of handwritten pages, scorched at the corners, the ink faded but legible. Across the top of the first sheet, written in careful Polish script, were the words, "Diary of Lieutenant K. Kucharski, Camp Starobelsk, 1940. The clerk brought it to his superior, Colonel John Maitland, who adjusted his glasses and read in silence. The handwriting was steady, disciplined, almost beautiful. The first entries were mundane: meals, weather, rumors of release. Then, abruptly, the tone changed. April 10th, trucks arrived. Officers called by name. The rest of us locked in barracks. We heard engines in the forest all night. By morning, they did not return. Maitland read on, his breath slowing. April 11th, new trucks. Same direction. We hear shots, regular, distant, every minute. He turned the last page and half-burned, words cut off mid-sentence. They said the forest was quiet now. Maitland lowered the sheet. He had read hundreds of reports since the war, atrocities, testimonies, accusations. But this was different. It wasn't propaganda or hearsay. It was the living pulse of a man who had seen what the world was still denying. He sent a cable to the Allied War Crimes Unit in Nuremberg. Have received Polish diaries corroborating Smolensk executions. Request verification. Within a week, 2 investigators from the International Tribunal arrived in London. One was Major Harold B. Cole, an American lawyer with a face carved by sleepless nights. The other, a French translator named Madeleine Fournier, whose family had vanished in 1940. They pored over the documents under a single lamp, tracing every letter with reverence. Madeleine whispered, "These are ghosts speaking." The microfilm copies from Rome included not just Kucharski's writings, but others from the Second Polish Corps, pages saved before the fire at Naples. The handwriting varied, but the details converged, same dates, same trucks, same forest. All pointed to a single place, Katyn. By summer, the investigators prepared to present the diaries as evidence. But even in victory, politics still drew its lines. The Soviet delegation at Nuremberg had already declared Katyn a German crime, blaming the Nazis for the 1940 massacre. To contradict that narrative was to challenge the alliance itself. The Cold War was beginning, and truth was suddenly a liability. When the tribunal convened that September, the atmosphere was tense. Judges from the Allied nations sat in heavy silence, flanked by interpreters and military guards. The air smelled of dust and ink. On the long table lay the evidence, photographs of the burned pages, translations, and the faintly charred originals sealed in glass sleeves. Major Cole stood to speak. "These diaries," he said, his voice calm but taut, "were written by officers of the Second Polish Corps, men who survived Soviet captivity and later served under Allied command. They document in real time the disappearance and execution of Polish prisoners in 1940. They were smuggled out, nearly destroyed, and preserved at great risk. What you are about to hear are not accusations, they are memories." He opened one folder and began to read, April 12, 1940. "We are told to write our names on cards before boarding trucks. Some joke that it's for our rations. We hand them over. Later we realize they were for the graves." The courtroom was silent except for the translator's voice echoing the words in German, Russian, and French. Some of the judges avoided eye contact. Others wrote notes with trembling hands. When Cole finished, Madeleine placed a photograph of the burned diary on the projector screen. The room darkened. The image flickered to life, black and white, the handwriting glowing under the lens. Around the singed edges, the ink looked like dried blood. "This page," she said softly, "was found half-burned in Naples. The man who wrote it did not survive the war, but his words did." In the corner, the Soviet representative, General Zoraya, rose abruptly. "This evidence is inadmissible," he barked. "It is falsified by fascist elements to defame the Soviet Union." Cole remained still. "General," he said quietly, "are you accusing the dead of forgery?" The translation rippled through the hall. Zoraya's jaw tightened. "The matter of Katyn is closed," he snapped. "It has been proven to be a Nazi crime. We will not dignify this slander." The gavel struck. The chairman declared the session adjourned. But in that suspended silence, history shifted. For the first time, the words Starobelsk and Katyn were spoken together before an international court, carried on the smoke of pages that refused to die. Outside the tribunal, journalists gathered under umbrellas, shouting questions. Cole and Madeleine said nothing. That night in their hotel, they continued to read the surviving diaries. Among the fragments was one line that neither could forget. "They told us we were going home. In a way we did." For days, they worked in secret to catalog the evidence before political pressure buried it. Copies were sent to the British Archives and the U.S. Library of Congress. Others vanished mysteriously en route, intercepted, perhaps destroyed. Yet enough survived to seed doubt, to keep the question alive in whispers and footnotes. In Warsaw, the Polish communist press denounced the diaries as imperialist forgeries, but underground printers reproduced fragments, passing them hand to hand. In Paris and Rome, émigré newspapers published excerpts under pseudonyms. The truth began to seep through cracks in censorship, slow as water through stone, and somewhere in London, an anonymous curator placed the burned originals into a metal cabinet marked restricted. Evidence 272A. For decades, they slept there, sealed in darkness, waiting for history to catch up. The men who had written them were already fading into poverty and obscurity. Sergeant John Baran, the printer who had smuggled the first copies, worked in a factory in Birmingham. Every week he visited the Polish church and lit candles for his fallen comrades. He kept one photograph folded in his wallet, the ruins of the Naples warehouse. On the back he had written, "Where they tried to burn us." He died in 1958, unknown and uncelebrated. His widow mailed his effects to the Polish Institute in London. Among them was a final notebook, pages of copied text, handwriting uneven with age. The first line read simply, "To those who still remember the smell of smoke." Historians would later call it the Baron Codex. It contained transcriptions of multiple diaries lost in the fire, reconstructed from memory. When experts compared them decades later to the original fragments, the words matched nearly perfectly. Even memory, it seemed, could not be silenced. By the 1960s, as East and West glared across an iron curtain, the diaries resurfaced again, now as weapons in the quiet war of information. Western broadcasters like Radio Free Europe began reading excerpts on air, soldiers' last words, descriptions of forests thick with silence, the echo of single gunshots. Millions of listeners in Eastern Europe heard those broadcasts in secret, huddled around radios under blankets, terrified yet hungry for truth. In Moscow, the regime fumed. The Polish embassy issued statements calling the broadcasts lies spread by capitalist saboteurs. But among the people, belief had already taken root. The dead were speaking through the static. Madeleine Fournier, now working for UNESCO, kept the original microfilms in her private collection. She considered them sacred relics, proof that words could outlive empires. "Each line," she once told a colleague, "is a pulse under ash. You can still feel it beat." When she died in 1973, she left instructions for the reels to be donated to the Polish Museum in London. They arrived sealed in wax, labeled in her handwriting, "Ashes and Testimony." It would take another half-century for the full truth to emerge. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, official archives in Moscow confirmed what the burned diaries had claimed all along. Lists of executions, signed orders, NKVD reports, every detail matched the Polish accounts. In 1990, the Russian government formally admitted responsibility for the Katyn massacre. The ghosts had been right from the beginning, but by then most of the men who had written the diaries were gone. Their words alone remained, fluttering through history like charred pages refusing to settle. At the reburial ceremony in 1995, on the edge of the Katyn forest, Polish veterans carried candles shaped like books. They placed them on the soil where their comrades had fallen. The wind moved through the trees like turning pages. A priest read aloud from one of the recovered diaries, and Kucharski's preserved at last in full. "I write because they cannot. I remember because forgetting is another kind of death." When the priest finished, silence fell, the kind of silence that feels alive. The candles flickered in unison, as if bowing to the words themselves. In the archives of London today, the diaries rest behind glass, their pages still faintly stained with smoke. Visitors lean close, reading the neat Polish handwriting, the edges crisp where fire once licked. Beneath each display is a small plaque, recovered from Naples, 1947, donated anonymously, evidence in the Katyn proceedings. Words that survived fire. Tourists pass by quietly, some wipe tears, some take notes, but most simply stand, unable to move, as if afraid that breathing too loudly might scatter the ashes again. Because in those words lies more than history. There lies proof that truth, even when burned, can still illuminate the dark. The forest at Katyn was quiet again. Too quiet. Beneath its roots, bones had turned to dust, and dust had turned to silence. Yet far from those trees and in Moscow and Warsaw, in London, the battle over truth was still raging, fought now not with guns or fire, but with paper, ink, and fear. By 1950, the world had already begun to forget. The Cold War hardened like winter frost, and the Katyn massacre became an echo no one dared follow. Official histories in the East named it a German atrocity. In the West, governments tiptoed around the subject, wary of fracturing the fragile balance with the Soviet Union. The Polish government in exile in London shouted into the void, their cries muffled by politics, and yet, buried in that same London, in a basement below the Polish Institute on Prince's Gate, the ghost still whispered, there, behind an iron door, stood a row of metal cabinets labeled only with years, 1939-1947. Inside them lay the smuggled diaries, the burned fragments and thousands of pages of correspondence from soldiers of the Second Polish Corps. Few knew the collection existed. Fewer still were allowed to read it. The curator, a thin, soft-spoken man named Antoni Kulesza, was one of the last keepers of this forbidden truth. Each morning, he descended the creaking stairs with a flashlight and a thermos of tea. He moved like a priest entering a crypt. He treated the diaries not as evidence, but as relics, the last voice of a murdered nation. When he opened the drawer marked Naples 1947, the smell of smoke still lingered. He would lift a page with gloved hands and trace the edges where fire had eaten through ink. He once told a visiting scholar, "They tried to burn these words, and now they burn us from within." But outside those walls, Poland's story was being rewritten by men with red stars on their caps. The communist regime in Warsaw erected monuments to victims of Nazi aggression. Katyn was named on plaques as the work of Hitler's SS. To question it was treason. School children learned only half the truth and newspapers printed none. The truth had gone underground, hidden in whispers, in church sermons, and in those drawers beneath London streets. In 1959, deep within the Kremlin's archives, another door closed quietly. Behind it, a steel cabinet was sealed with wax and locked with triple keys. Inside were folders stamped Top Secret, Special Folder Number 1. The documents inside bore Stalin's signature. They included Beria's execution orders, the NKVD lists, and the reports from Smolensk detailing the mass graves at Katyn. For 30 years, that cabinet would remain untouched. Generations of officials passed its silent weight without daring to open it. But its existence haunted the few who knew. One of them was a historian named Dmitry Volkogonov, a Red Army general with an inconvenient conscience. In the 1970s, as he worked within Soviet military archives, Volkogonov stumbled across references to the sealed folder. He requested access and was denied, but the curiosity lodged in him like a splinter. He began quietly collecting evidence, intercepted memos, witness reports, photographs, and hiding them in his home behind false walls. The truth, he wrote later, was treated like contraband. Meanwhile, in Poland, the Second Corps veterans were dying out. Their children inherited boxes of letters, medals, and photographs, but few knew the full story. Some diaries were passed down like holy texts, read only on anniversaries, whispered by candlelight. Others were buried again, this time beneath family floors hidden from the secret police. One such heir was a man named Piotr Kucharski, the grandson of Lieutenant Kazimierz. He had never met his grandfather, but he grew up hearing his name in fragments. When his mother died in 1978, he found a small tin box among her belongings. Inside was a diary, thin, bound in scorched leather. Its pages began with a single line: "If the fire did not win, neither will fear." Piotr was 22, a history student at Krakow University, and already watched by the regime for his involvement in underground publications. He copied the diary by hand night after night, and smuggled pages to friends who printed them anonymously in samizdat journals. The word spread like sparks. Each time a new issue appeared, the secret police raided student apartments, confiscating typewriters and arresting editors. Piotr evaded capture for 2 years, then disappeared one winter night in 1981 during the crackdown on Solidarność. His friends believed he was imprisoned, but no records were ever found. Only the diary remained, and copies continued to circulate, whispered from one generation to the next. In the West, silence began to crack. Journalists from the Times and Le Monde published exposés in the 1970s, using information leaked from émigré archives. They quoted lines from the diaries recovered in Naples, connecting them to Soviet command orders discovered by defectors. Slowly, the narrative shifted. When Volkogonov, now a reform-minded general under Gorbachev, finally gained access to the Kremlin's sealed files in 1990, he opened folder number 1 with shaking hands. The papers inside confirmed everything the burned diaries had said half a century before. By order of the Politburo, 21 1957 Polish prisoners are to be shot. He wept as he read. That same year, Gorbachev admitted Soviet responsibility. The world watched in shock. But for the old veterans in London and the families of the Second Polish Corps, it was not revelation, only recognition. They had known all along. The British archives unsealed their own boxes soon after. Antoni Kulesza, now frail and gray, was invited to witness the transfer of the original diaries to the public record. He arrived in a wheelchair, a small Polish flag pinned to his lapel. When the archivists lifted the burned notebooks into the light, tears rolled down his face. At last, he whispered, "They breathe again." The historians catalogued each volume, photographing every page, even the half-burned ones. In one margin, still faint but visible, were the words, "May our words outlive our bodies." Kulesza died 2 months later. At his funeral, a young curator read from his notes, "We do not protect paper. We protect voices." By the late 1990s, the world was finally ready to listen. Exhibitions opened in Warsaw, London, and Washington under the title, "Voices from Fire, the Diaries of the Second Polish Corps." Visitors stood before glass cases holding the scorched pages, the handwriting trembling like ghosts under the lights. One display featured the photograph of the Naples fire, the warehouse engulfed in flame, silhouettes of soldiers watching helplessly. Below it, a caption read, "They tried to burn our truth. Instead, they made it indestructible." Among the visitors that day was a woman in her 50s carrying a small notebook wrapped in cloth. She introduced herself as Marta Baran, granddaughter of Sergeant Jan, the printer. When the curator opened the notebook, he gasped. It was the lost Baran Codex thought destroyed decades earlier. The ink had faded, but the words remained. Truth travels faster than fire. The museum acquired it, placing it beside the original fragments. For the first time since 1947, the pieces were reunited. The ghosts had come home. But truth, once revealed, rarely rests. In 2010, when a Polish Air Force jet carrying the nation's president and dozens of senior officials crashed near Smolensk, the same region as Katyn, it felt to many like history repeating itself. Wreaths laid at the Katyn Memorial were scattered by wind and fire again. People whispered that the forest was cursed, that it demanded remembrance. At the crash memorial, one survivor of the Second Corps, a 100-year-old man in a wheelchair, was asked what he thought of the coincidence. He shook his head slowly. "No coincidence," he said. Katyn remembers who forgets. Today, deep in the Polish Institute's archives, the original Naples fragments are stored in climate-controlled cases. Each year, scholars from around the world visit to study them. They note the strange beauty of the handwriting, steady, deliberate, untouched by fear. One scholar described it as script written for eternity. The ink has darkened with age, but under ultraviolet light, you can still see faint traces of smoke embedded in the fibers, physical memory of the night they tried to burn the truth. On the final page of Kucharski's diary, preserved like a relic, a single line stands alone. "If someday the world reads this, tell them we did not die quietly. It has become a national epitaph." Engraved now in stone at the Katyn Memorial, at Monte Cassino, and even in London, near the river where so many exiles found their end. The legacy of the Second Polish Corps is not carved in monuments or medals, but in words, fragile, flammable, indestructible words. What they could not defend with rifles, they defended with ink. What governments buried, they unearthed line by line. And in the end, it was their diaries, not their weapons, that defeated the last lie of the 20th century. History had tried to silence them with ice, with exile, with fire, but the truth has its own stubborn way of surviving. Sometimes it hides in a suitcase or in a tin box buried beneath a floorboard. Sometimes it sleeps in an archive, waiting for the right pair of hands to open it. And sometimes, as in the case of the Second Polish Corps, the truth becomes its own army. Invisible, unstoppable, marching through time in the ink of the dead. The courtroom was cold. Not by temperature, but by history. The kind of cold that seeps from marble walls and paper. The kind that comes from waiting too long to speak the truth. In the spring of 1992, more than 45 years after the first burned pages were discovered in Naples, an international hearing was convened in The Hague. Not a trial this time, but an inquiry. A reckoning. The Soviet archives had been opened. The names, signatures, and orders had been published, and yet the world needed to see, to hear, to feel, not just to read the truth, but to face it. Before the panel of judges, under the soft hum of fluorescent light, sat a long table covered in black cloth. On it lay the diaries, the same pages that had traveled through desert, snow, and fire, the same handwriting that had outlived its authors, the same ink that had refused to die. Scholars called it Exhibit Resurrection. One by one, the curators from London and Warsaw opened the protective cases. The air seemed to hold its breath. On the front row sat the last survivors of the Second Polish Corps, men and women now in their 90s, faces lined like maps of a long-forgotten war. At the center sat one nameplate, Professor Marta Baran, historian, granddaughter of Sergeant Jan Baran. She wore her grandfather's unit insignia pinned to her collar. In front of her lay his notebook, the Baran Codex, its ink faint, its edges browned by time. The presiding judge, an old Dutchman with a scar running from temple to jaw, adjusted his glasses. "We are gathered," he said slowly, "to consider evidence once thought lost, evidence that speaks for those who cannot." The lights dimmed. A projector hummed to life. On the screen appeared a magnified image of the first burned diary page, the one that had been rescued from the ashes of Naples. The handwriting was jagged but legible, like a pulse under soot. "If truth must die, then let it die screaming." A murmur rippled through the room. Professor Baran rose. Her voice was soft, accented, carrying the rhythm of both grief and pride. "This line," she said, "was written by Lieutenant Kazimierz Kucharski, who was executed by Soviet authorities in 1948 after refusing to deny what he had written. His words survived him. They became the cornerstone of everything we know about Katyn, Starobelsk, and the journey of the Second Polish Corps. Today, these diaries return not as relics, but as witnesses." She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the notebook. "I will read from the entry dated April 11th, 1940. The trucks left again tonight. We could hear the forest breathing. Someone whispered that the snow covered more than earth now. I tried to pray, but the wind sounded like a shovel. For a long moment no one moved. Even the translators hesitated before speaking, as if afraid to disturb the air. Then, one by one, the other curators read from the surviving volumes, fragments stitched together from fire and memory, from a diary recovered in Persia. They said we were free, but the desert has no fences. Freedom is a direction, not a place. From an officer's journal at Monte Cassino, the monastery burns. The smoke smells like home. From a POW letter smuggled through a Red Cross truck. If I die here, tell my mother I fought for her memory. As each voice echoed, the room filled with something larger than sound, the weight of time folding in on itself. The judges listened without interruption. Some wrote nothing at all, simply watching the words pass like ghosts across the screen. When the readings ended, the presiding judge stood and said quietly, "We cannot render a verdict on the dead, but we can let their words live." He gestured to the evidence table. These diaries were once considered contraband. Today they are scripture. Outside the courthouse, the rain began to fall, not hard but steady, washing the dust from the marble steps. Reporters waited with cameras asking questions that had no answers. Professor Baran emerged last, clutching the codex under her coat. She stopped on the steps, looked up at the gray sky, and whispered something in Polish. "Wróciliśmy, dziadku." "We came back, grandfather." It wasn't a victory. It was something purer, the end of silence. That same year in Warsaw, a new exhibit opened inside the Museum of the Polish Army. It was small, tucked between larger halls dedicated to tanks and uniforms. The sign above the door read, "The voices they tried to burn." Inside, the lights were low. Visitors walked through a tunnel lined with glass cases. Behind each pane floated a diary, lit from beneath as if glowing from within. The handwriting shimmered like constellations. Speakers played faint whispers, real soldiers reading their words, recorded from surviving tapes found in the archives. At the end of the hall stood a simple display, a photograph of the Naples docks in 1947, fire curling through the night. Below it, a single charred notebook lay open under glass. The caption read, "Recovered from the ashes of Naples. Author unknown. Saved by comrades. Burned by fear. Preserved by faith. Every visitor who passed it fell silent. Many cried without knowing why, because somehow, even after half a century, those pages still felt alive. Across Europe, interest reignited. Universities began teaching courses on the Second Polish Corps, not as footnotes to Allied history but as central to it, a symbol of endurance against oblivion. Documentaries aired on television. Schools recited the soldiers' poems alongside those of Wilfred Owen and Tadeusz Borowski. And in London, the archives finally released the last sealed box marked Evidence 272A. Inside were a dozen photographs taken by a British investigator in 1947. Among them was one that no one had ever seen. A group of Polish soldiers standing before a burning warehouse, their faces illuminated by flame. Their eyes calm, not defeated, not afraid, just watching. On the back in pencil, someone had written, "We knew they would burn it. That's why we memorized every word." It became the defining image of the Ghost Diaries, the moment when silence became resistance. By 2000, digital restoration technology allowed the scorched diaries to be fully preserved. Every torn edge, every smudge of ink was scanned and reconstructed. Linguists pieced together missing lines using cross-referenced copies from survivors. The result was breathtaking, a 1,200-page collection titled The Polish Testimonies, Words from Fire. Its publication sent shockwaves through academia and politics alike. Reviewers described it as a resurrection in paper. Copies sold out in weeks. The New York Times called it the conscience of Europe bound in ash. For the first time, the world saw the war through the eyes of those who had no country, men who fought, lost, wrote, and vanished. Their diaries did what bullets could not. They reached across time and forced the living to look. In one passage, long thought irretrievable but revealed through restoration, Kucharski had written, "I do not write for vengeance. I write because forgetting is a privilege we do not deserve." Those words were later inscribed at the entrance of the Katyn Memorial Chapel, where the walls are lined with the names of the dead, carved not in marble, but in dark wood, the grain resembling flames. And yet, the most haunting moment came decades later in 2015, when a small ceremony was held at Monte Cassino, 71 years after the battle that made the Second Polish Corps immortal. The last surviving veterans gathered under gray clouds, standing among rows of white crosses. A young officer, representing the modern Polish army, stepped forward, carrying a glass capsule. Inside it lay a single page from the Naples fire, preserved under crystal. He placed it beneath the monument's foundation. "So that," he said softly, "the wind can no longer steal it." A bugler played the old melody Czerwone maki na Monte Cassino, the red poppies on Monte Cassino, and the sound drifted over the valley like a prayer. As the final note faded, rain began to fall again, light, almost hesitant, as if the sky itself was trying to turn the ashes back into ink. The diaries that had once shocked the war crimes judges have become part of world memory now, not documents of accusation, but documents of endurance. They taught that the written word can be stronger than empire, that truth, even burned, buried, or denied, will find its way through the cracks of history. They showed that one soldier with a notebook could outlast armies with rifles, and they proved that even in war, the most dangerous weapon is the human need to remember. When the camera fades to black, a single voice remains, an old recording found in the archives, the voice of Lieutenant Kucharski himself, reading from his diary before his arrest. "If one day someone finds these pages, know this: we were not saints, but we were faithful. We were prisoners of time, not of courage. They took our land, our brothers, our names, but they could not take our words." The voice crackles, then fades. A final title card appears, stark white on black. The diaries survived. Their authors did not. The screen stays dark for a full 10 seconds. Silent, heavy, holy, then the sound of turning pages, fade out.